Hi, everyone. Welcome to Berkshire Green Drinks. Thanks for joining us this evening. This program is organized by Berkshire Environmental Action Team, also known as BEAT. We're a small nonprofit based in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. If you don't already know about us, you can find out much more on our website, thebeatnews.org. That's BEAT. We also have end-of-year newsletters in the back. On our website, you can find a community calendar with events from other organizations and individuals that have sent us those. We have an environmental jobs board, and there's also public notices that we update every week for Western Massachusetts. Also on our website, you'll find a donate page. If you really enjoy this program and would like to support BEAT and free educational programs like this one, there are many ways to do so, and you can find out there. We also have a donate box in the back. So just one event that I'd like to spotlight on September 2nd, which is a Saturday, we are celebrating BEAT's 20th anniversary. And we'd love, and we would love to have everyone there to celebrate with us. The renovations, the first phase of the renovations on our building will be finished, which also includes a balcony overlooking the Housatonic River behind our building. Jane's going to lead a tour at 1:15 p.m. and then we're also doing an optional tour also. We're also doing a stream table demonstration at 2 p.m. And you can find out more on our website. Again, that's thebeatnews.org. I think that's all I have for you. So I'm going to hand it off to Steve Sears, the owner of the Stationery Factory and the president of MassWildlife's board. Great.
Thank you, Chelsea. Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Sears, and we just had our 10th anniversary of purchasing the Stationery Factory. So that was 2 weeks ago.
That on your shirt, sorry. People on Zoom can't hear you. I didn't even think about it.
Sorry, Zoom people. Clipping it to my glasses, so I'll hand it to Adam when I'm done. So, Paul and I had the opportunity to work for a great company, craning company, for a long, long time. We grew up together in this neighborhood, and we were able to do really good work because we worked for people who cared about the environment. One of the things that we did together is we protected the boulders, which is about 350 acres plus or minus. So the first place I caught a trout when I was 3 years old with my dad, I caught 2 of them. And when we signed the protection of that land, I still look at that as being one of my best accomplishments, because as companies change hands, those things could get developed, and it's a great piece of property. So we had that opportunity to work together. I'd like to thank Paul, and also Gene Shaggy, who is just, he reaches out to a community that no one else does. So Gene is a wonderful, wonderful guy, and thank you for all you do. He keeps everybody in touch. Anyways, Stationery Factory, we've owned it for 10 years, and this part here was built as a shoe factory in 1889, and I worked here when those were outside windows back in 1977, before that room was built. We now have over 20 businesses with almost 100 jobs, and come and see one of our shows, or for a small event. We have a big room out there, and we have 2 really wonderful people who run our events business, Mr. Abe Guthrie and Lisa Guthrie back there. So they keep everything going. So. And as a volunteer, one of the guys I met when I was in junior high stocking fish was George Derry, and I eventually got involved with the Mass Outdoor Heritage Foundation. Eventually, when George went off the board of MassWildlife, I took his place, and that was in 2017. And so I've been the Western Mass rep for MassWildlife. There's 7 members. There's 5 regional members and 2 specialists. And then as of last July, I was the acting director of MassWildlife. So now I'm the chairman, and boy, you never know what can happen when you volunteer. So. Anyways, without further ado, I can't say how proud I am to be associated with this group of people and scientists and people who absolutely do the most incredible work for us. It's not a huge group of people. It's about 150 plus or minus that work for MassWildlife, and we do everything from, you know, the things everybody knows about are hunting and fishing, but there's a ton of work that's done for endangered species and work like that. And the board of directors for MassWildlife represents everyone in the state. We don't just represent people who hunt, fish, and trap. We are the trustees for everyone in Massachusetts to make sure that all of the missions of MassWildlife are done for everyone. So I just think some people don't realize that, but it's really important for us. So, and without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to Adam, who will tell you about wild trout, and then he's going to take questions, I believe, too. So, oh, you got your own microphone? All right. Thank you.
On? Okay. All right, let's start again. All right, so I'm the Coldwater Fisheries Project Leader for MassWildlife, and basically what that means is anything cold water related, predominantly dealing with wild trout, I have my hands in to some degree. So I do a lot of applied research projects, monitoring, working with different groups on conservation measures and monitoring and all sorts of different things. So I work all over the state. I work with multiple districts, everywhere from Cape Cod out to here, in and around Boston. So I'm all over the place. And so today I'm going to talk about our wild trout fisheries and a bit about how we go about managing our wild trout fisheries here in Massachusetts. Probably the bulk of the presentation will be a general overview of our wild trout resources, status, distribution, things like that, how we're managing these fisheries. And then I'll sort of quickly go through 2 of the major river trout fisheries that we do a lot of work on. So the Swift River in central Mass, and then a bit closer to home for you guys, the Deerfield River up north. So I won't have a lot of time to go into detail on those, but I'll show you a URL for the website we have for the Swift River and all the work we do there. And if anybody's interested in, learning more detail about some of these projects, feel free to reach out after this, because I just won't have time to kind of get into the weeds. All right, so obviously this is a map of Massachusetts. Everything in black is a stream or a stream reach that has records of naturally reproducing wild trout. As of last year, we haven't added any of the data from this year. Not that we've been able to collect very much because it's rained a lot, but anyway, as of last year, we have 1,277 identified wild trout streams in Massachusetts. And you can see they're spread really across the state, from Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, in and around the Boston metro area even. And then once you start getting to Worcester area in west, they're almost harder to find than they are not to find. So they're really widespread. The vast majority of these support wild brook trout, and I'll go through our major trout species in more detail in the next few slides, but this was just an overview right here. So the vast majority of these almost 1,300 wild trout streams are wild brook trout streams. We do have a fair number of brown trout streams, and again, I'll go through this in more detail. A few rainbow trout streams, and then sort of concerning at this point, 132 of these 1,277 streams have no current evidence of wild trout. So what that means, at some point in the past, we had evidence of wild trout in these streams, And we've since resurveyed them in the past 10, 15, 20 years, and we haven't turned up any trout. That doesn't mean that they're completely gone, but it is concerning, meaning that they've either dropped to a level of abundance that we can no longer find them in the places that we used to find them. So I'm not saying they're gone, they still might be there, but it's concerning enough that we've, quote unquote, lost a few of these streams over the past couple of decades. And then there are a few streams with historic records, but no current data, so we have to get out and resurvey those. All right, so I'll run through each of these, our major wild trout species, in a little bit more detail here. So again, brook trout, by far the most widespread, by far the most abundant of our wild trout. They're also our only native trout, only one of two native salmonids, the other being the Atlantic salmon, which are basically extirpated. But really our only inland native salmonid is the brook trout. And you can see that they're spread out across the state. We find them in almost every major drainage across the state. There's maybe 3 or 4 that we don't find brook trout streams. And again, they make up the vast majority of wild trout here in Massachusetts. A little bit about what our brook trout fisheries look like. They're really dominated by relatively small individuals. So our brook trout, and really throughout most of their range until you start getting up north in some of the lake run populations, or further up north in some of the big rivers, brook trout really don't live that long. 2 or 3 years is about average. Occasionally, but rarely, do we see a 4-year-old brook trout here in Massachusetts. And so a fully mature brook trout is going to be 2 or 3 years old. Sometimes they even mature after their first year, but that's not that common. And they top out about 5 to 7 inches. Very few of the wild trout that we have, based on over 500,000 records of individually measured brook trout that we've surveyed over the past 60, 70 years, only about 5% of those are longer than 8 inches. So we do find them occasionally, but if you catch an 8-inch wild brook trout, it's really a trophy. There are a few places that we have them, but not very many. There are some unique fisheries, and I'll talk about one of them in a bit more detail when we talk about the Swift. But the Swift River, our sea-run brook trout streams, really are the places where you're going to find much larger fish. Not necessarily older, but they have the conditions, year-round cold water, not a lot of flow fluctuations, especially with sea-run streams, access to more rich food sources, so they can grow a bit bigger. And so we see in the Swift, you'll see some pictures. We see fish, exceeding 20 inches in the Swift River, and up to 15 and 16 inches we survey every year in some of our sea-run streams. So substantially larger than your average small stream brook trout. So brown trout, obviously brown trout are an introduced species. They're not native to North America. They were brought over sometime in the late 1800s. I don't have an exact date, but they've since been stocked, really all over the country, including Massachusetts, and they still stock them to this day. And they've seemed to catch on in a fair number of streams, not nearly as many as we see with brook trout, but you do see brown trout particularly concentrated in some of the tributaries of the Connecticut, the Deerfield River and some of its tributaries, and especially out west here in the Housatonic and the Hoosic drainages. You do see a few scattered around sort of central and eastern Massachusetts, but those tend to sort of disappeared over the last 20 or so years because we have curtailed some of our stocking of brown trout in a lot of areas. And so some of these were kind of propped up with a yearly influx of brown trout that happen to reproduce. So we don't necessarily see some of these eastern populations as much as we used to, but they're still really well established in the western part of the state. In general, our wild brown trout fisheries look fairly similar to our wild brook trout fisheries, especially in smaller stream settings. They live about 2 or 3 years. They get slightly larger on average, but usually that's because they tend to live in areas that, in streams that are a little larger, a little warmer, have access to more food resources, have more space to grow, in contrast to the brook trout, which are, sort of relegated to the much colder water and into these, less productive headwaters. So on average, we see brown trout slightly larger. We also see, a much larger proportion of our wild brown trout, greater than about 10 inches, where you may not find a brook trout over 10 inches anywhere except for a few spots. We find wild brown trout over 10 inches in a few areas. In particular, some of the large river systems like the Hoosic, at times the Housatonic, and the Deerfield, where we find, brown trout in excess of 24, 25, 26 inches. And these aren't 2 or 3 year old fish, though. They do have the ability to live quite a bit longer than we see with brook trout. So, some of the big 20+ inch brown trout that we're finding in the Deerfield, for example, are 7, 8, 9 years old. So they live a little bit longer, have the capacity to get a little bit bigger. And we also have wild rainbow trout in just a few spots, really concentrated in a few streams in the sort of Clesson Brook area of the Deerfield, the middle of the Deerfield River. Again, these are introduced species like the brown trout. They're native to North America, but they're native to the Pacific Northwest. They were brought over, roughly, the same era as the brown trout, late 1800s, and they're, stocked heavily across the state, but they just haven't really caught on, like the brown trout. Part of that is they're adapted to a rain-dominated system out in the Pacific Northwest. They're also in the wild spring spawners, so laying their eggs in the spring, they're at a pretty big disadvantage to brook trout and brown trout, which lay their eggs in the fall and hatch out even before rainbow trout lay their eggs. So they're really, really behind the 8 ball on that, and so they just really haven't been able to catch on in a lot of places. But they are established, and there's pretty good populations in Clesson Brook and some of the tributaries to the Deerfield in that area. But they make up a very small proportion of the wild fish. And we don't know a lot about our wild rainbow trout fisheries. We're in the process of learning more. We're working on some projects with Deerfield TU and trying to learn a bit more about these small isolated populations. But in general, what we do know is they tend to look similar, size, structure, abundance-wise, as what we see with brown trout and rainbow trout. So generally small fish, generally short-lived, but there are a lot of unknowns. So rainbows are sort of well known for being highly migratory, and we find, adult rainbow trout in the Deerfield, that are smaller than we usually stock. We also see, large fish in there that, it's hard to tell a stocked fish from a wild fish just by looking at it. I know people say they can, but it's not always foolproof. But we do see large fish in there that look a little bit different. So there are a lot of unknowns, whether, the surveys that we're doing in some of these small streams are sort of misrepresenting the population, and we're just seeing sort of, young of the year and fish that are rearing in there before they head out into the main stem Deerfield, for example. So this is some of the stuff that we're working on, trying to learn a bit more about our wild rainbow trout. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, that's sort of a overview status distribution of our wild trout resources here in Massachusetts. And feel free, if you have questions, to ask them at the end if you've got something more you want to know. But so I'll just give you a quick rundown of how we, sort of a big picture of how we manage our wild trout resources. And so a lot of it starts with, how we classify these fisheries. And so, the broad scale classification for wild trout streams falls under this Coldwater Fish Resource designation. And so any water body that contains a coldwater fish, and not all coldwater fish are trout. I know I focus a lot on trout. almost all of my work revolves around trout, but there are other cold water species. And so if we go out and do a survey and we find any of these species in a stream, we can use that as evidence to designate the stream as a cold water fish resource. I have the trout highlighted because everyone knows that we do stock these 3 species of trout. And so the caveat here is they have to be wild. And so we can tell if these fish are wild if they're, if there's reproduction. So if we see little young of the year fish, or if we see adult fish that are smaller than the size we generally stock. So we tend to stock large fish that are larger than most of these fish would get in the wild anyway. So that's, and then we can also, we know where we stock, so we can decide if these fish are wild or not. Once a stream is designated as a CFR, it's afforded a number of additional protections. And so I'm not going to get into this too much. I'm a biologist. I don't deal with a lot of the regulations and laws and statutes and acts on a regular basis. I do have to know some of it, for some things, but it could be a whole presentation in and of itself. But the CFR is afforded protections under things like the Water Management Act, extra water quality standards in the anti-degradation clause, under various different statutes, Rivers Protection Act, Wetlands Protection Act, a number of different things. And if you want more information, feel free to pull me aside after or send me an email, and we can go over some of this stuff. I don't find it that exciting to talk about, so we can talk about it outside of this. But just know that it's an important designation to be classified as a CFR. A number of things go into it, and these fisheries get additional protections. So, a few years ago, we started thinking, this is, obviously it's great to have these protections for these CFRs, but how do we sort of think about this more wild trout specific rather than sort of an umbrella with all cold water fish? Because, we do take an ecosystem approach to management, but, trout just are a very important species. Recreationally, it's a charismatic species. And so we wanted to learn a little bit more about, how we can make this wild trout specific. And also, how do we make it more meaningful for anglers? Make it more meaningful conservation-wise, for targeted land acquisition, things like that. And so, first step was take all of the CFRs, which are available, publicly available. There's a list, there's a map, and then find those that support wild trout. So it turns out that over 99% of CFRs are also wild trout streams. There's very few streams out there that have other cold water species but not trout. So that didn't really narrow it down too much. So the next step we took is to try to classify our existing wild trout streams into meaningful categories. So we could manage them, as block units rather than manage them all the same as CFRs, or manage each one as an individual system, which is just, it's untenable to be able to try to manage something on an individual basis. So we wanted to be able to sort of put these in meaningful categories. Other agencies do this all across the country. They all do it a little bit differently. They all use different metrics, which they use to classify. So there's really no consensus on what is the best metric to use. So we looked at, all of our data in our database. We thought about what would be meaningful for us, and really simple abundance. The number of trout per kilometer was the predominant data we had, and also, what we thought was meaningful. So, rather than using biomass per hectare or something like that, we just chose simple abundance. And so and I'll go through an example. This might be a little confusing to start with, but I'll go through an example that hopefully clears it out. So our classification system, which I'll go through on the next slide, is based on percentile. So percentile grouping. So, above the 90th percentile for abundance puts you in a certain category. Between the 50th and 75th percentile in abundance puts you in another category. And hopefully that'll be clear on the next slide. But anyway, these percentiles are going to be relative to the trout species present. So we're only comparing streams with brook trout, other streams with brook trout, or brown trout to brown trout, we don't want to compare, a stream with only brook trout to a stream with only brown trout, because it's not going to be comparing, apples to apples. It's going to be sort of apples to oranges. We also used relative to stream order. So if you're not familiar with stream order, it's a classification system in and of itself. It's a really basic idea. If you think of a watershed and all the tributaries that come in and make up the main stem that exits that watershed, high up in the watershed, headwater tributaries with no tributaries of their own are first order streams. Two first order streams come together, that's a second order stream. Two second order streams come together, that's a third order stream, and so on and so forth. And so this is useful because it can be used as a surrogate for stream size. Headwater streams are smaller than fifth order streams, and also position in the landscape. So we wanted to break out our classification system relative to those two caveats. All right, so let me just run through an example. Hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. So we came out with 4 categories, 4 classifications. Above the 90th percentile, which is class A, for example. And so we're still playing with some of the descriptors, so those may not be the same when we're done with it. But anyway, four categories, based on percentile bins. And then if you look over here, this is all the data from our database, that we've had for, since we really started collecting data. And so putting all this together, for an example, a first order, so a headwaters brook trout only stream that has 945 brook trout or more per kilometer would be a class A first order brook trout stream. Say we go out and do a survey on a stream. We do our standard 100-meter survey, we get 50 brook trout. Extrapolate that out to a kilometer, that's 500 brook trout per kilometer. We find out from our GIS maps it's a second order stream. We only found brook trout, so it's a second order brook trout only stream with 500 trout per kilometer. That would be a class C stream. So we can put all of our trout streams in a classification, and so we know a little bit more about them just based on that. So we can manage them a little bit more effectively, and I'll have some reasons why that's important here in a moment. So it's much easier to manage them in these groups, much more meaningful than it is to try to do them each individually or try to do them all the same. It's not perfect. None of these classification systems are perfect, but it's an attempt to try to manage these at a little bit finer scale. We also have additional classes that, based on mostly missing data. So these are all targeted for updated surveys. So some of our historic surveys or maybe missing stream length data. So we can't necessarily come up with a trout per kilometer. So these are all scheduled for updated surveys. So we can put them into the classification system. So what are some of the uses then? One of the main ones is, promoting angling, informing anglers. So we recently put out an angling survey, an email survey, and a lot of what came back is that anglers want to know more about where to go fishing. And that's something we had thought about already, even before we put out the survey. And so, people have limited time. Do they really want to trek off into the woods and explore a stream they don't know anything about? Some people do, some people like that, but probably the majority of anglers aren't necessarily going to use their 1 day off or their 2 days off or something to go out and look for these streams. We have 1,300 of them. They're just going to go to the Swift or the Deerfield or one of the stocked ponds or something like that. So having this information available, for anglers to say, well, I want to fish, a class A stream. I don't care where it is, I want to go to class A stream. So we'll have those. There's going to be hundreds of them. Somebody maybe just wants to fish in a stream that there are trout, and so they want to look close to their house. All they've got is a few class D or class C streams, but they'll pick one of those and go to them. And it really will help. This is a very underutilized resource. A lot of people talk about what it used to be like, that people used to fish small streams more often. There's a contingent of people that fish them, but it's not like the pressure that some of these bigger rivers get. There's so many of them, and there's so many good ones that I don't think they'll ever necessarily be highly pressured, but it is something we want to be able to promote. And then even more importantly, or at least on par with informing anglers on this stuff, is using this to prioritize action. So say for example, a piece of land comes up for sale along a Class A stream. We might really want to aggressively pursue that and protect that for access or for long-term conservation. Or something comes up where we can partner with a local watershed organization or a Trout Unlimited, for example, and they're interested in a stream that maybe is a Class D stream. Well, then we can start thinking about how do we go about getting some funds or some work done to restore some of that stream. So it might be bumped up into a different classification. It helps us identify survey locations. It helps us identify climate refugia. So it has a whole host of different actions to help us prioritize, again, rather than just picking some random stream from a list where they all look the same, or concentrating on a stream just because it's there. We have a little bit more information about it. All right, I think I might be running a little bit long. Okay, all right, so that was the bulk of the presentation. The rest of this I'll sort of run through a little bit faster because I don't have hours and hours to go through each of these, so I'll just try to hit the highlights. So two of the main, most of what I talked about is small streams, wild trout, things like that. These other two fisheries that I'm going to be talking about, they are wild trout fisheries, but they're much larger systems, more popular. One being the Swift River tailwater. And this URL, if anybody's interested, has a write-up of some of the work that we did a couple of years ago, where we marked hatchery fish to assess survival and movement. And then also it has a lot of preliminary write-up about the work that we're starting right now with the help of Mass Outdoor Heritage Foundation and Pioneer Valley Trout Unlimited, where we're going to be pit tagging wild brook trout and assessing movement and habitat use throughout the river, and also looking at changes in population metrics through time. So if you're interested, there will be a lot more information there, a lot more than I can go through today. Oh, and also, all the pictures in this section are from the Swift River, and all the pictures really throughout this whole presentation are from Massachusetts. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Swift, I'm sure most of you are if you fish. It's a tailwater fishery, so tailwater is not really a technical term, but basically it means that the water is released from the bottom of the upstream reservoir being Quabbin, which is the largest reservoir in the state, and it's managed as a drinking water supply. So it's pretty consistently the same level, and the water that's coming out of the bottom of that reservoir is pretty similar temperature year round, and you really don't get any fluctuations in flow unless there's an agreement with the Connecticut River. If the flow in the Connecticut gets too low, they bump it up, but really not much flow fluctuation throughout the year. So you really get consistent conditions in cold water year round. So that's really what makes this river what it is. It's one of the most abundant populations of wild brook trout in Massachusetts. Exceptional size structures, I think you'll see with some of the pictures in this part of the presentation. So that really makes it the best wild brook trout fishery in Massachusetts. And anecdotally, without data on hand, I would say it ranks up there with one of the better wild brook trout stream fisheries in really all of New England. It's a small section of river, it's only about 7 miles long, so it can't compete with some of the big rivers in Maine for sheer numbers, but in this 7 miles, the size, structure, and abundance is really, really eye-opening. It's also heavily stocked, mostly with rainbow trout, but also some brown trout and a few tiger trout. And it's extremely popular with fly anglers. Easy access, consistent flow, clear water, lots of trout, technical fishing. It's really got it all, and you can, any day you drive by, weekdays, weekends, whatever, it's going to be packed. Again, the most interesting piece of this fishery is the wild brook trout. Brook trout haven't been stocked in this river since the early 90s. So it's been 30 years since any brook trout have been stocked in here. So these are all wild fish, and they're extremely abundant. In some cases, we're seeing 3,000 or 4,000 brook trout per kilometer. Whereas in an average stream, we'd see 250, 300 is a good number of brook trout per kilometer. And big fish too. So this fish here is 4.5 pounds. And so some of the proposed research that I guess it's no longer proposed, we're started it. This is a slide I took from another presentation. But anyway, we're trying to develop a better estimate of population metrics. So things like abundance, growth rates, mortality, size structure, age distribution, things that are really important to understand the fishery, and things we just have an idea about now. We don't really have hard numbers on any of this because we haven't done any research to get at some of these real numbers. And then also understanding how they use the river. Where do they go in the summer? Where do they go in the winter? When do they move up to spawn? Where do they spawn? Is it segregated by age and size class, et cetera, et cetera? If there's a pulse of warm water, which there occasionally is from Quabbin, if you get a wind event, or a couple of years ago we got a lot of rain and it spilled over. If there's a pulse of warmer water, how does that affect their distribution? Things like that. So a lot of questions can be answered with some of this work we're doing. So we have fixed antennas in the river. We're going to be injecting pit tags in brook trout, and it's just a passive integrated transponder tag, a small tag that goes in the body cavity. So every time it goes over these antenna, it'll record tag number, and so we'll know which fish went over what time. And also when we recapture these fish, we'll know where we collected them last time, how long they were, how much they weighed, things like that. All right, so moving through this pretty quick. So the other major project that we're doing on a large river is on the Deerfield River. Again, this is also a tailwater fishery. It's managed much differently than the Swift River, and it's probably a little complicated to get into, but it's not a drinking water supply. It's a power generating dam with a pump storage facility up on the hill, but there's also power generating dams upstream on the Deerfield, and this has a very small reservoir. So it's managed more for power generation, run of the river. So you do have very significant flow fluctuations almost on a daily basis, and also much warmer water conditions on average than at the Swift. So it's predominantly a brown trout fishery because of the water temperatures, although we do find a few brook trout occasionally. So it's long been considered a high quality trout fishery. It's very popular with guides, anglers. It's one of the only rivers you can really float fish year round. It's more similar to a river you'd see out west. And although stocked rainbow trout are likely the major fish that are caught by the average angler, people catch a lot more rainbow trout than they do brown trout, even though they're probably about 50-50 in the system. They're just easier to catch. But trophy brown trout are really the major draw. So, 20+ inches is pretty frequently caught by anglers, and we see them up to 24, 25 inches. But, there's been an ongoing debate for a lot of years whether or not those brown trout in the river are mostly stocked fish or if there's reproduction in their wild fish. So we do stock the river with a fairly small number of fish, but we really didn't have a good answer to that until more recently, when we were able to actually survey the river with some of the new equipment that we got donated by Deerfield TU, this electrofishing raft. So again, we didn't really have a good answer, but pretty simple, straightforward project, answer the wild stock debate. And then while we were out there, gather data on key fishery metrics, like population size, recruitment, things like that. Both of these are gonna, even though they're very simple questions, the answers are gonna have really important management implications going forward. So simple projects, simple results. We clipped all the hatchery fish with an adipose clip. It's a fin that doesn't grow back. And we stocked them as usual, and then we went back and we did our surveys. And so over 4 years of data, we found that over 81% of the brown trout were unclipped. So 81% of the fish were presumably wild fish. And small proportion of hatchery fish in the system, but really not a huge contribution to the population. So that was pretty straightforward. Abundance was lower than expected. Really only about 110 brown trout per mile. This is only taking into account adult fish. So young of the year and smaller fish that don't necessarily get targeted by raft electrofishing techniques may bump this up a bit. But really anywhere, brown trout are not super abundant in Massachusetts. The average for all of our wild brown trout fisheries is about 170 fish per kilometer, and the mean for the Deerfield is about a third to a half of that. So it's higher than the average for other similar sized systems, but still it's pretty low, lower than expected given that the Deerfield is such a large river. It has really good habitat, for the most part, but without having a lot of hard data to back it up, I can't exactly say why it's low, but I do have my suspicions that it likely has to do with the up and down nature of the flow management, where we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. And I think that's a lot of what's holding back this fishery. So young of the year surveys. So we do young of the year surveys using a backpack electrofisher and target them specifically in transects that we do every year. And started this in 2020, 2021, very low abundance of young of the year brown trout. 10, 12 fish over 4 100-meter transects. Contrast that with the Swift, where we're getting, we're only doing 50-meter transects in the Swift, and we're getting 200 or 300 young of the year brook trout in one transect, and we're getting 10 to 12 in all 400-meter transects on the Deerfield. So that's saying something about young of the year survival, whether it's at the egg stage or swim up fry stage. Something's going on. In 2022, we saw a 4-fold increase. So we found almost 45, still not a huge number, but for the Deerfield, a huge number of young of the year in the same transects. So what does that mean? In 2022, and again, this is only 1 year of data, so it could just be an anomaly, but in the winter of 2021, 2022, Brookfield Power, who recently relicensed the dam, are required to do a double of minimum base flow from fall through spring. So it used to be 125 CFS, it's now 250 CFS. So when they bump up the flows for power generation up to 800 or 1,000 CFS, and the brown trout come into the shallow gravel side channels, dig their redds, lay their eggs, and leave as the water drops. The water drops to 125 CFS, and a lot of where they just spawned is now exposed. These eggs are exposed to the air, desiccation. If it's cold over the winter, they can freeze, and the predominant thought is that that's where the problem comes in, is a lot of these eggs are dying before they can hatch. And so the new relicensing agreement Brookfield Power is now required to, well, it's not going to be implemented just yet, so I haven't finished yet, but they're now required to do 250 CFS. So hopefully that means that more of these reds, more of these eggs are going to be, underwater when they drop the flows to base flow. But the key is 2021, 2022, they tested to see if they could actually do it. So they weren't necessarily sure they could do that because of the small reservoir upstream. They weren't sure if they could actually fulfill the 250 CFS throughout a winter. Turns out they could. They did it, and we saw this increase. Again, you might have to take this with a grain of salt because it's only 1 year, and there could be a number of other things happening, but it is encouraging for the future. Unfortunately, though, they aren't supposed to implement that 250 CFS for another 2 or 3 years. So we'll see. Yet to see what actually is going to happen. So a couple of recommendations that we're working on here for the Deerfield. It's predominantly a wild brown trout fishery. So major management decision this year, we no longer stock brown trout in that section of the river. That's from Fife Brook Dam down to Route 2 in Charlemont is now a wild brown trout fishery. It predominantly was before, but now it essentially is. Relatively low abundance, again, surprising given the amount of habitat, but we talked a bit about what might be the case for that, but it's a little bit of speculation right now. We're still trying to work out why that might be occurring, but we'll know more in a couple of years. It seems to be recruitment is limited, so it seems to be that the problem is at the egg stage or some stage in the early life history where we're not seeing a lot of young of the year fish. But once they reach adulthood, survival is really good. And I don't have the figures to show you just out of interest of time, but adult survival seems to be really relatively steady. Low abundance, but steady survival. And we're going to continue monitoring as we go forward. All right, so last slide, I think I probably went over, but all this kind of goes into a working document that we use as sort of our guiding philosophy on how we want to manage wild trout now and moving forward. So, all of our database information from the past, all the surveys that we do, all the district surveys, all that feeds into how we manage our fishery. Some of the specific projects that we're doing on some of these more popular fisheries like the Swift, like the Deerfield, all of this is part and parcel of a wild trout management plan that we really are using to learn more about, promote our wild trout fisheries, not only for long-term conservation, but also, as recreational fisheries, which, we do have some good ones. So that's all I've got. My contact information here for anybody who wants to reach out afterwards. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got plenty of time, so.
Does anybody have questions?
So you're only measuring the trout population, doing any population statistics on any of those other cold water fish that aren't as popular with anglers?
So the question was, am I doing anything else with cold water fish that aren't trout? So not specifically. We do a lot of work, sort of ecosystem-wide management, and a lot of that falls on some of our climate change biologists who does a lot of work with sort of non-game species and things like that. But personally, I mostly focus on trout, but that is a good question. And we've got more information if you're interested.
Well, I mean, you've got all these other native fish that live there, and now you're introducing and you're managing things entirely for mostly non-native trout.
Well, I would say mostly native brook trout. I mean,
At least in the
so on the Deerfield, yeah, the Deerfield is the one project that we really focus on
and
brown
the
trout.
Swift, you said they were after the rainbow trout.
No, Swift River is brook trout. We do stock rainbow trout in there,
Okay.
but that's not really my decision. But yeah, we're focusing on the wild brook trout.
But those are stock brook trout.
No, those are wild fish. We haven't stocked in there since in over 30 years.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm wondering if you see any indication of competition between the brown trout and the brook trout. And I'm wondering in the places where you stop stocking the brown trout, do you see any change in the brook trout? Or do you only stop stocking the brown trout when you see a predominantly wild population?
Okay, so I'll start with the first part. Do I see any competition between brook trout and brown trout? You know, I don't have data on that, but just anecdotally, it seems like they're fairly segregated. You know, again, if you remember the map, there's brook trout in a much larger area of the state. There tend to be in sort of colder headwater streams, smaller systems, and the brown trout tend to be in sort of further downstream. So they tend to be segregated, but they do overlap in, you know, a number of places. And, you know, anecdotally, I don't see a huge amount of competition. Where we do find them together, we find, you know, young of the year of both species, we find adults of both species. There isn't like an overwhelming majority of, or one or the other. It tends to be when they overlap that they're you know, fairly even. And then what was the second part?
I was wondering, in the places where you stop stocking brown trout, do you see a change? I'm assuming there are places where you stop stocking brown trout and there are some brook trout.
Yeah.
In those places, do you see any change in the brook trout population? And also, your answer to the first question, I think I got a follow-up, and that is, historically, were the brook trout down where the brown trout are now?
So I'll start with that one. So historically, data is sparse. You know, it's not, things weren't done the same, you know, in the past, but presumably yes, but not necessarily because of brown trout. You know, there was less development, you know, the climate wasn't as warm, so there were probably brook trout further downstream in a lot of these systems. So whether it was the brown trout or climate change and development, it might have been a combination of both. And then the other one is we don't have a lot of long-term monitoring data at places where we used to stock and we no longer do stock. You know, one thing that jumps out is some of the sea-run brook trout streams down on Cape Cod in the southeast used to be managed exclusively for sea-run brown trout. I don't know why, it was just a different mindset back then. And so since that stocking discontinued, you know, around 30 years ago, in most of those streams, the populations have bounced back. You know, but there's also been a lot of work done in those streams, habitat work and things like that. So again, you don't know, it's like a chicken or the egg kind of thing, but you know, it's a good question. And I wish I had, you know, really good data at different streams, but people, you know, they stop stocking and they don't think to do pre and post data, you know, so not a very good answer, but.
So when we're looking at the slide that was talking about stream classification, the criteria for what makes a trout stream high quality, right? So like Kautza for first and second order streams was a higher population density than for third, fourth, and fifth. I mean, I would assume that the further down the drainage you go, the more consistent the water level is. So what kind of factors are you guys consider when you're looking at that?
So the question was, why are first and second order streams classified at a higher abundance level than further downstream? And so that's a simple one. Further downstream, the warmer water gets. So you don't see as many trout further downstream, you know, unless you have a situation like the Swift River, which, you know, is a high order stream, but it's interrupted by the dam, so it's cold water. So yeah, they generally are higher abundance, higher up in the watershed.
Hi, I have two questions. One, are there any real spring creeks in Massachusetts, not just tailwater, but places with steady flows, or small? And if so, where are they? No. And how are they doing? And if not, why do you think not? The other question is, can you tell us anything about the Hoosick River from North Adams to Vermont?
Okay, so the first question is, are there spring creeks in Massachusetts? And the short answer is yes. Anything that's predominantly fed by groundwater could be considered a spring creek. And so, where you find, sand and gravel, you tend to have spring creeks. So most of the trout streams in the southeastern part of the state, Cape Cod, are technically spring creeks. Most trout streams, except for those that flow through bedrock, do have some level of groundwater influence to keep them cold. But they are, sort of true spring creeks are sort of in that part of the state. Our sea-run brook trout streams are essentially spring creeks. Consistent flow, pretty consistent water temperatures year round. And some of the major problems with those are development. So, municipal wells, private wells that are taking water out of that aquifer can drop the water level. Surface runoff, road runoff that's getting funneled to these streams introduces warm water, which can sort of counteract that effect of groundwater. But yeah, we do have spring creeks. And then if you think about sort of floodplains of large river systems where you start getting sand and gravel, you can find spring creeks. So, like Great Brook in Southbridge is a spring creek, essentially. It's in the Westfield River floodplain. There's a lot of situations like that where you actually find, sometimes better trout habitat lower down than you do higher up. But, there's sort of various degrees of that. And then the second part was,
You talk about the Hoosick River from North Adams to
yeah.
Vermont.
Okay, so the Hoosick River, it's a complicated system, and without getting into like an hour-long discussion about the Hoosick, it has its issues, but it has a really good brown trout fishery. Big fish, some reproduction, but you've got the limestone factory, which is a problem. You've got the Adams water treatment plant, which is a problem. You've got channelized sections between Adams and North Adams with no tree cover. You've got the flood chutes through town, both Adams and North Adams, roller dams. So a lot of problems, but it's still holding up. But there's a lot of work that could be done. The tributaries are awesome. I mean, even though they're beat up in their lower reaches too. I was down, I actually did some surveys on some of the tributaries today. And all of the tributaries that come into the South Branch are absolutely loaded with brook trout. There's some of our better sort of small stream wild brook trout populations. They're just so productive with all the limestone in the drainage. If you go to the North Branch, it's a different story. Far less productive, more sort of volcanic rock. Some of those tributaries to the North Branch have some of the lowest conductivities that we see anywhere in the state. So a very big difference. But yeah, the Hoosick, it's a great place. I like fishing the Hoosick, but it certainly is well used.
I have some Zoom questions. What effect, if any, sorry, what effect, if any, does stocking of brown and rainbow trout have on wild fish populations, including brook trout, but also other species? And then particularly, do those periodic pulses of stocked fish have an impact on food availability for wild populations?
So do you want me to repeat that, or since you, okay.
Thank you.
All right, so complicated question. It depends. And again, we don't have, large-scale data to say one way or the other, just because, historically we haven't collected that sort of data. But, it really depends. Most of our stock trout don't last very long. Work we did on the Swift on the stock trout, which should be perfect habitat. It's essentially, like living in a hatchery, but you're not getting fed. We see a huge decline in abundance of stocked fish, even within a week. Whether they're caught or whether they die, we don't really know the mechanism, but they don't last very long in the wild, especially rainbow trout. They've been domesticated for well over 100 years. They're not really equipped to survive in the wild. Brown trout a little bit better, but we don't know specifically what the impacts are, but it's likely to be very short-lived in most cases. And we do stock a lot of fish across the state, but aside from some of the major rivers, we don't stock a lot of fish in each individual water body, especially streams. So the footprint of stocked fish is likely to be small. It's maybe not completely insignificant, but without having the data to back that up, I'd say it's likely that it's a small impact. And also, it's debatable on how much impact they have on the food source because they're pellet fed in the hatchery. They do have instincts, but when they transition to wild feed, they're probably still looking for pellets for the most case. I was watching a fish on the Swift the other day when we were installing pit tag antennas, and it came up for a piece of pine cone, a pine needle, another piece of bark, and ate all three of them. And we occasionally kill a fish on accident when we're electrofishing, and if it happens to be a stocked fish, we look in its stomach, and there's usually rocks, sticks, and all things that aren't food. So, not saying that's every stocked fish, but in general, I feel that the footprint's fairly small.
In Massachusetts, we have a 7-mile Jackson Lake, primarily in Chesterfield, which also has a lot of brook trout. Is that an area we've just kind of given up on? We're not going to study and try to find a way to keep that going?
In Chesterfield Gorge?
The upper west.
Okay, so the question is are we doing any work in the east branch of the Westfield in Chesterfield Gorge? Not at the moment. We've got a pretty small staff. So, it's something that I'm interested in looking at, but the Westfield is sort of a, margin, at least the main stems, all the branches are fairly marginal temperature-wise. All the tributaries are, pretty chock full of brook trout, and they do use the main stem, but, this year is probably fine, but most years it gets pretty low and pretty warm, and you don't see a lot of wild fish in the main stems. But certainly, it's a place I'm interested in, but we've got so many projects at the moment. Maybe down the line we'll do some work there. So keep in touch if you've got some specific things you might want to get looked at.
Another non-wild fish floating, but now that you're not stocking browns in the upper Deerfield, does that affect in any way the stocking of rainbow?
So the question is, because we stopped stocking browns in the upper Deerfield, are we no longer stocking rainbows? So we are still stocking rainbows. It makes up the bulk of the catch. People want them in there. The average angler is probably going to catch 3/4 of their catch is probably going to be stocked rainbow trout relative to wild brown trout. The guides like them because it helps their clients catch fish all day. And there's some question on, because they do hold over fairly well in there, maybe not from year to year, but certainly throughout the summer. So they may have a bigger impact, but there's so much habitat in the Deerfield that isn't being used by brown trout because of sort of the low abundance there. If we start to see, increased survival of young of the year, and we start to see more adult brown trout, and we see it reaches a peak, and we might start to think about, well, our rainbow trout, filling up some of that space that brown trout could. That's a question for down the line. But for now, for the foreseeable future, it's going to be, business as usual with the rainbows.
Another small question. Have you studied at all the brook trouts above 5 brook on Monroe Bridge now?
So have we looked at brook trout in the main stem Deerfield above Fife Brook, so in the dryway section? No, we have the...
Not dry anymore.
Yeah, yeah, it's called the driveway because, it fluctuates so much. But, we only have the most recent data we have from the driveway is from the early 2000s. It was on my list to survey this year, but haven't been able to get into it. I really do want to look up there because we can sort of use that as a contrast to the section below Fife Brook, because the driveway only gets like 30 whitewater releases every year, whereas below in the Fife Brook section, it gets over 100. So there's much more up and down in the Fife Brook section than there is in the driveway. And just, it's one survey, but from the early 2000s, there was far better abundance of young of the year brown trout and brook trout in that section upstream. It's just one data point, but I'd like to get up there and do some more. But it's not the easiest place to survey. It's sort of marginal. It's kind of too big for backpacks.
That's why we like it there.
Too big for backpacks and not quite, my rafting ability to take thousands of dollars of electric fishing equipment down it. So, certainly we're going to get to it, but not this year.
Hi. First, thank you so much for basing decision-making on data.
Yeah.
I appreciate that so much. I had a question about in assessing the streams and the areas that you're looking to protect or that people are working with you to protect. Is there a mechanism, when you talk about showing those on a map that's accessible on a website, are there also streams that are being protected that aren't indicated to the general public just because you know that they're supporting a refugia or an area where it's a high value you don't want people to recreate?
So the question is, I'll sort of paraphrase, I guess. So the question, and tell me if I'm wrong, the question is, are we, keeping streams sort of quiet from recreation to give them additional protection?
Or is there a mechanism to do that?
Okay.
So if I'm interested in assisting with protection for fish and wildlife,
Okay.
but I'm not necessarily looking at it from an angler's perspective, is there a mechanism with the mapping that you're talking about to assist in the preservation without having it appear on a map somewhere that highlights it?
Okay, so is there a mechanism to assist in preservation but not highlight it for recreation? Okay, so short answer is no, because we're a fish and wildlife agency, so our budget is generated by fishing and hunting licenses, excise taxes on fishing equipment, hunting equipment, boat gas. So we really do cater to outdoor recreation. Not solely. We're not just going to give up on things and just say have at it. But we don't necessarily keep things secret. But, I think that probably lowest on the rung for problems with our fisheries are anglers and people who recreate.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that it's a problematic, but that I didn't know if there was a mechanism that you had identified to say or these are assisting with the abundance, but don't necessarily need to be mapped in a way that also brought more visitation or more access to, and that just might be something that's considered in the future. Yeah,
so, okay, right now we don't do anything like that. But, that's, I usually don't get sort of questions or comments like that. Usually my crowd is, yeah. So, yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't really thought too much about that. But yeah, so nothing in the works for that, but it is something to think about.
Last questions. I'm just wondering what your favorite thing is about trout.
Well, you know, I don't know, that's a hard one. What my favorite thing is about trout. It's usually the places they live. You know, it's usually, although we do have some streams in the Boston metro area that aren't super pretty to look at, but you know, the fish themselves are beautiful. The places they live are generally beautiful, and you know, I do like to fish for trout as well. So you know, it's probably those three things.
I have a question. A number of the questions here tonight were about the effect of the stocking program on native species. And the answer seemed to be, we don't have the data, which is a perfectly good answer. Is there any chance the state could be convinced to start collecting that data so we would know the effect of the stocking program on native species?
So the question was, are we planning to collect data to look at the effects of stocked fish on native species? Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that sort of thing, but it's kind of a difficult project in that we'd have to either start stocking a stream that isn't stocked to get that information, because places that are stocked, if there was an effect, it's already happened by now. And there's just so many variables. If we stop stocking and monitor what happens with the population, it's very hard to say that it's because we stopped stocking. So it would be something, sort of a long-term kind of detailed project, maybe more suited for academic, like a graduate student or something, you know, where you would take a stream or, you know, a handful of streams, stop stocking, monitor, and then start stocking again. And certainly that would be a great way to figure it out. But, you know, it'd be difficult for me to do, I think. You know, it's something I would like to do, but I just don't have the time to try right now. Maybe down the line. But I do want to just say that, you know, there are a lot of questions about stocking, and, you know, it does seem like it's stocking, especially based on our, you know, some of our social media, but we don't stock that many water bodies. So of the 1,277 wild trout streams, we really only stock about 11 or 12% of those. So almost 90% of wild trout streams are wild trout streams, and they don't get stocked. Most of the ones that do get stocked are larger, more accessible wild trout streams. So the vast majority are not stocked. So I think that there's kind of this notion that we stock all wild trout streams or a large number of them, but we really don't. You know, so it's a pretty small proportion.
Thank you so much, Adam. This has been great. We have another round of applause. And thank you, Steve, for making this fantastic place available for us. And if anybody has more questions for Adam, you can try to snag him before he